Welcome to the outreach session for cybersecurity. I am Susan Pollock, an accountant at the Ontario Securities Commission in the Compliance and Registrant Regulation Branch. With me is Brian Everest, the Chief Technology Officer for Starport Managed Services. This is an OSC disclaimer. Please take a moment to read it over. Brian is going to start us off today with some cybersecurity basics and tell us about some new cyber challenges and threats. I will then provide an overview of the CSA Cybersecurity Staff Notice published in October of 2017. Brian will then provide some more detailed guidance for what you can do to prepare for and mitigate the effects of cyber threats. During the session, please feel free to submit questions and we will try to address them at the end of the session.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to start off by defining what is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is the process of ensuring all of your corporate IT infrastructure is secure, in the office, in the cloud, applications, remote users, and mobile devices. The biggest challenge of cybersecurity is how to make things secure while still making them easily accessible by users and customers, and with a realistic IT budget. Most mid and small size companies have networks that are similar to this diagram. Larger organizations may have extra locations, more remote users, or have data center hosted equipment as well as on-site servers, but the general principles are the same of a secure perimeter, usually with a firewall as the gateway between the internet and the internal network. The firewall may just be a router supplied by Bell or Rogers in smaller organizations and would be a more full-featured device in larger companies. PCs and notebooks usually, but not always, have antivirus and sometimes local backups for their data. Servers, if there are any in the office, will have antivirus and backups. Sometimes the backups are just file level backups, sometimes server images or offsite backups to another location. Most companies will be running Windows 7 or newer operating systems on their desktops, although a few XP boxes still remain, generally for legacy applications, and Windows servers will be 2008 or newer. Mobile devices will be Android phones about 60% of the time, and Apple phones about 38%, and then Blackberries and some others making up the other 2%. The IT infrastructure items on this slide include all the technical measures a firm should have in place, but policies, processes, and user training also need to be part of the overall cybersecurity picture. These items make up the basics for a solid IT infrastructure, and having them in good working order are enough to fight off most of the run-of-the-mill IT issues. But cybersecurity is evolving more rapidly than other areas of IT, and the best practices that worked in the past will not be enough in the future, as we will discuss when we look at the new types of threats, cybersecurity concerns that are emerging. The common threats that have been around since the beginning of PCs are background noise, and they'll not go away, and every business must protect themselves against them. And they're addressed by regular IT best practices and are just considered a cost of doing business now. To summarize the list, malware is a catch-all for all the bad and unwanted software. Malware is growing increasingly destructive and expensive to deal with if an event does occur at your company. The latest types of malware is ransomware, which many of you unfortunately may have experienced firsthand. It is reported by Malwarebytes, a maker of antivirus software, that about 50,000 PCs a month are infected with ransomware in Canada, which means about 2% of all business PCs in Canada experience a significant cyber threat every year. Phishing emails have replaced generic spam as the biggest email threat. Phishing email are better crafted than regular spam emails, and on the surface look like legitimate email and are harder for both users and anti-spam systems to detect. Spam is now like physical junk mail, annoying but easy to handle, while phishing emails are less obvious and more likely to convince you to click or reply. Social engineering in cybersecurity terms refers to any activity a cybercriminal would use to obtain IT access or information using social relationships. This can be as simple as showing up at your door and asking for access to the server room, or calling on the phone and pretending to be IT support, or more elaborate scams like attempting to befriend employees or setting up fake business partnerships. Users remain the biggest attack vector, to use a good security term, with 80% plus of security incidents directly traceable to the actions of a person, whether accidentally clicking on the wrong attachment or maliciously doing harm with the access they have inside the company. There are many new kinds of cybersecurity threats, and I'd like to cover off 4 of the most pressing. Spear phishing is a targeted attack similar to phishing emails, and spear phishing is usually in the form of email, but does not have to be, and it's against high-value individuals and organizations. The cyber criminals do their research before making contact and usually have detailed, unique information about the company to make their requests for money transfers or invoice payments seem legitimate. The best prevention of spear phishing is multiple channels of approvals. For example, if an email request is followed up by a phone call or an in-person confirmation of the request, the second channel being something outside the control of the original requester. Denial of service attacks consist of someone making a company's IT assets unusable, whether it's making a website unavailable or making applications unable to run. Large-scale denial of service attacks, called DDoS attacks, usually consist of thousands of devices that are part of a botnet that is being directed to send traffic to the same service and overwhelm the environment. What is new with these denial of service attacks is the motivation, using the attack to extort money from a company or to cover up other cyber attacks. The attack can last for days if the goal is to cause harm to an organization, or just a few minutes if the attacker wants to demonstrate their ability to conduct a denial of service attack and just wants a ransom payment. For example, the company mentioned in this slide that had to pay $1 million and be able to get their websites back in operation again. Malware is also changing. Worms are a type of malware that spread very quickly with little interaction from users. In the past, users had to open bad email attachments or launch the applications to get it to spread to each PC. But with worms, they can scan a network and jump from PC to PC, making the spread very rapid and difficult to contain and repair. Another very new type of malware is crypto mining viruses. These viruses use up CPU resources to do crypto mining. There's one type of crypto mining malware that consists of over 500,000 servers and is used to mine a type of cryptocurrency called Monero. The companies who are running these servers do not know that the virus is there, and other than looking at their server usage or network traffic patterns, it's very difficult to spot these types of crypto mining viruses. Another type of virus that is difficult to detect are fileless malware. And these refer to viruses that do not install any software on your PC, but instead use built-in Windows tools like PowerShell to run instructions that are provided remotely. This gets around most antivirus software, which is based on looking at bad software running or the names of known files. Another concern, which is outside of regular PCs and servers operating systems, are security vulnerabilities in hardware. You may have heard something in December about Intel announcing a security vulnerability. This was a huge hardware vulnerability impacting almost all PCs made in the last 10 years. Intel released a fix for the problem in January, but that was determined to cause more instability issues, and the patches were rolled back, and no new replacements exist yet. So most systems remain exposed, and getting this resolved and all old systems patched will be a very big cybersecurity task for 2018. There's been a change in the behavior in the last few years about cybersecurity and the types of threats, moving primarily to a profit-driven model rather than just hackers pushing technical boundaries with security. Also, cryptocurrencies make cybercrime safer for the criminals as they can be paid in untraceable currency. Also, organized crime provides financing and allows people to work full-time at hacking, so the hackers become more proficient and able to launch multiple simultaneous attacks against different targets, sort of like a reverse IT service company time-sharing their employees between customers. Recently, it was announced an organization called Infraud, which had over 10,000 members, and was organized like a large corporation, had been responsible for over $500 million in thefts since 2010. There's also large organizations that have political or social goals, such as the shadow brokers or Anonymous. The shadow brokers had access to the government security tools, and some of the tools that they leaked allowed the creation of the WannaCry virus that happened in the spring of 2017. The Petya virus is also believed to have been created by a government, this time the Russian government targeting companies in the Ukraine, and other countries and users were infected as collateral damage. Government-sponsored attacks can be particularly dangerous because they may have tools and knowledge that are not available to the wider cybersecurity community. For example, Metrolinx was targeted in January of 2018 by North Korea. It's thought this may just have been a test run, picking a lesser target to test out the defense strategies of a transit agency before targeting a higher value target like the New York Transit Authority. Some examples of how cyber criminals are able to make profits. 3 billion pieces of data were available for sale on a website set up to be a clearinghouse for illegal data. The data was obtained from a variety of sources, some publicly available, some from the dark web, and pooled together on one website. Jordan Bloom, pictured here, has been charged, but not convicted, of selling personal data through this online site. He'd earned over $247,000 in sale from the site at the time of his arrest. And Kim Baratov from Hamilton was charged with working with Russia's Federal Security Services to access Yahoo accounts illegally. He was 18 at the time of the Yahoo attacks and had earned over $200,000 for his work. Baratov was apparently unaware that the Russian government was the actual client for his services, and he was acting as a contractor. Free cyber tools also make it easier to engage in cyber attacks. Tools with names like Metasploit and Mimikatz are two very popular tools, and there's lots of tutorials about how to use them. The screen capture is a tutorial from YouTube with a step-by-step how to compromise a Windows 10 PC by creating malware using Metasploit. You can create a virus and send it off to someone in sort of under 10 minutes to get access to a PC if they click on the link. Social media has also made the amount of information available about people much easier to obtain. One example is a New York-based financial firm. An employee at a company befriends a person on Facebook. After a few weeks, they meet for lunch. Then on a second meeting, the person walks the employee back to their office, and this person plugs a USB containing malware into a PC during the office tour. On the third meeting, the person asks the friend if they can borrow their notebook to check on Facebook, but in fact, and actually to put on keylogger software on it in order to get usernames and passwords. The person then disappears and does not contact the employee again. The elapsed time spent? 4 weeks from first contact to getting full corporate access through the combination of malware on the USB stick and monitoring keylogging software. During a forensic audit, it was determined the hacker had first found out who to target based on comparing information available on corporate website, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The hacker then viewed the public profiles of the users and on Instagram and Facebook, and then tailored their own profile to line up with similar interests and use that as an excuse for friend requests. The technical hacks used were not particularly sophisticated, but the level of targeting the patients made it possible by the value of this corporate target that otherwise had very strong security practices in place that could not be breached. The Internet of Things is a term you may have not heard of, but it consists of all of the smart devices that now exist, things like home appliances, webcams, media centers, and Google digital assistants like Google Home and Amazon Alexa. Why is this part of cybersecurity for business? It's because Internet of Things devices can exist in corporate environments and can compromise employee IT security, and also can be risked in the supply chain if any partner organizations are exposed. One example of this is a website called Shodan. It lets you explore all accessible Internet of Things devices, including ones that are insecure and available for public access, things like industrial control systems, surveillance cameras, and webcams. Many of these devices have been left with default usernames and passwords. There's an example of webcams that are available in financial institutions, offices, and IT server rooms so that anyone can go and view. Also examples of Internet of Things data leakage. Samsung released a smart fridge that had a user's emails and calendar details in it so that the fridge could send them messages and reminders for grocery lists. Hackers were able to get access to users' emails through these fridges and can then use it to search for other useful information such as corporate logins or passwords in their email. Another type of fridge has a vulnerability that can be used as part of a botnet and denial of service attacks and used for sending spam. And it's estimated over 20% of all botnet traffic and the sending of spam is now generated by compromised non-traditional devices. So a TV, a fridge, a media center, or a webcam could all be working for someone else sending out this type of information. Many of the Internet of Things devices, particularly the earlier designs from sort of 5 years ago or more, were not designed to be patched and aren't possible to service by users. So there's no easy way to fix the devices or make them secure. Crypto exchanges is another target, and it sort of demonstrates the perfect storm of cybersecurity and the elements coming together. They're rapidly growing companies using new IT technology. They have public-facing network presence, and it's an industry that's just starting to implement regulations. It's not just Bitcoin that's vulnerable as well. There's any type of exchange can be vulnerable to these sorts of attacks. The underlying technology of cryptocurrency, blockchain, is definitely outside the scope of what we're talking about today. But it is important to note that blockchain has not been compromised in these attacks. Most of these attacks were simple hacks, such as redirecting the main login page of the crypto exchange site so a user would log in with their username and password and what they thought was the correct site, and then would get an error that their account was not working. Then the cyber criminal would use that information to go to the real exchange site, log in, and transfer the contents of the user's cryptocurrency wallet elsewhere. Crypto exchanges are much more profitable than most other forms of cybercrime. As a comparison, the WannaCry virus had a Bitcoin payment, and if your computer was encrypted, you could send money, a Bitcoin, to get your computer unencrypted. During WannaCry, which impacted millions of computers worldwide, it generated $130,000 in Bitcoin payments. As you can see, any one of these individual hacks of any of the crypto exchanges were many orders of magnitude higher than that. Now Susan will provide an overview of the staff notice for cybersecurity.
Thanks, Brian, for the update on the current cyber concerns. Let's now discuss the CSA staff notice published in October and how registered firms can manage the risks of cybersecurity. Potential cyber attacks or cyber incidents are a business risk to every CSA registered firm, and therefore all firms are required to establish, maintain, and apply policies and procedures that establish controls and supervision to ensure compliance with securities law and manage these risks. For the past few years, OSC and CSA staff have been asking firms about their cybersecurity policies and procedures during our regular compliance review. We've been gathering data, and cybersecurity has been identified as a priority area for the CSA in business planning. Accordingly, the CSA is working to promote cybersecurity awareness and resilience. Also, in response to questions and comments from industry stakeholders, CSA staff acknowledged a need for more comprehensive guidance about cybersecurity for registered firms. In the fall of 2016, along with the other CSA jurisdictions, we sent a survey to gather more detailed information about the cyber practices at CSA registered firms. The survey was sent to firms registered as investment fund managers, portfolio managers, and exempt market dealers. The survey was not sent to firms that are members of IROC or the MFDA. We achieved a 63% response rate. And in October, the CSA published the results of the survey, along with some high-level guidance for firms. The staff notice also sets out our cybersecurity expectations for registered firms. Basically, we want our registered firms to be prepared for cyber attacks and cyber incidents. To manage these risks, we've identified three main components of a firm's cybersecurity preparedness. The first area is policies and procedures. These would include from deciding which information and systems the firm needs to protect to outlining the ways the information and systems can be protected. Our registered firms have very specific client information, bank account numbers, client's net worth, social insurance numbers, addresses. I think this type of data is probably a cyber hacker's dream. The second area would be the training of staff on the firm's cybersecurity policies and procedures. And the third, an incident response plan for what has to occur when the firm is attacked and sensitive information was potentially leaked. These areas should be documented in such a way that if a firm called their legal counsel after a cyber event occurred, they would be able to easily provide the firm's defense by showing what protection they had in place, how all of their employees were aware of the protection, and their plan to remediate the situation. In the survey, we asked firms who at the firm was responsible for cybersecurity. At most firms, it was the Chief Compliance Officer or the CEO. Some firms use external consultants or have a Chief Operating Officer. Several firms indicated that they only had a few employees, so everyone and anyone at the firm was responsible for cybersecurity. Somewhat concerning were a few comments that firms made that cybersecurity was not a material risk to their firm given the size of the firm. However, we don't see the size of the firm as having any difference to the severity of a cyber incident for the firm. For example, even a small firm wouldn't want their client information to be made public, or other types of cyber threats that involve a cyber attack to the firm's systems where they'd be required to pay a certain amount of money to have access back to their systems. A colleague's husband runs a small tax accounting firm. Last year, a few days before the tax filing deadline, the firm's server was hacked and frozen. The firm was asked to pay a large sum of money to be able to access their data and client records. The firm struggled to get their last available backed up data and recreate any work not saved, at a time when they were already experiencing tight deadlines. The firm hadn't recently tested their backup recovery process, and it took 4 days to retrieve the required data. We expect firms of all sizes to have policies and procedures for cybersecurity, and most firms we had surveyed during the survey did tell us that they do have cybersecurity policies in place. In the comment section for this question, some firms indicated that their firm did not have a network, and therefore this question didn't apply to them. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I do think that any firm that uses the intranet in their operations would be at some risk for cyber attacks and incidents. One firm commented that they were a one-man shop and therefore no communication devices exist. I can't imagine a firm, though, that doesn't use email or have online access to systems for corresponding with clients and or service providers, such as client custodians and brokers. The staff notice guidance sets out the areas where we suggest all firms include in their policies and procedures, and it reminds firms that these policies and procedures might need more frequent updating given the ever-changing nature of the cyber threat world. The survey also gathered information about the frequency of risk assessments related to cybersecurity. The risk assessment done by the firm would form the basis of the policies and procedures required. For example, the firm would have to first decide which of its data is critical and should remain confidential, and which areas of the firm's operations are vulnerable, and also the consequences of the different types of cyber threats identified. As I mentioned earlier, I think most of our registered firms would agree that client information is critical and something that they must protect. As such, they should have policies and procedures in place to ensure that the client information is backed up and protected. Firms might also decide that their trading information would be critical data that they wouldn't want to become public. Majority of firms perform a risk assessment yearly. However, for this question, many firms chose the other line for the frequency of their risk assessments. And several comments from the firms included that they continually monitor this risk. Other comments that were of more concern were that firms felt that because they only had one computer that was secure or only one employee, this assessment wasn't necessary. That made me think about what happened to one of my uncles. A few years ago, he answered a phone call from a company that said they'd been noticing that he's been having issues with his computer and would they like their help. He just had to provide access to his computer and they could look at it remotely. It was too late once we'd realized that the company was malicious and was looking for access to his personal information and money. He ended up unplugging the computer and never used it again. He was one person with one computer, and cybersecurity was still very important to him. Brian, how do you see firms staying on top of their cybersecurity risk assessments?
Making cybersecurity risk assessments a scheduled activity, usually annual, and something that's often outsourced to a third party to assist with the assessment. Also, risk assessments is something that should be done when significant changes occur in the IT environment, system upgrades, new IT platforms, or even new policies and procedures.
Once the firm has decided which data they would like to protect and ways to protect it, they have to train employees to follow the policies and procedures they've created. The survey results indicated that most firms do provide training to employees and that this training focused on what to do for suspicious emails or links, good password practices, and the safe use of hardware or software. As we noted in the guidance, employees are often the first line of defense against an attack, so adequate training is essential. As with policies and procedures, given the ever-changing landscape of cybersecurity, training may have to occur more frequently for this area. Brian, you mentioned earlier that users are the biggest threat when it comes to cybersecurity. Do firms have enough training in place for their employees?
Users are definitely a company's greatest exposure for cybersecurity incidents, and user training can make a significant difference in avoiding incidents or even just recognizing that an incident is happening. Our experience with our clients show a significant difference in environments where users have regular training versus those who do not. When we do security testing, we're often contacted by users who had gone through training who recognize the unusual activity or refuse to give out information, while untrained users are much more likely to cooperate and provide usernames, passwords, or don't notice when unusual activities are happening.
The last area for which we communicated our expectations in the staff notice is for a documented incident response plan. Similar to expectations for firms to have a BCP or disaster recovery plan, firms should have a plan for the communication and remediation of a cyber incident. We outlined some areas that a good incident response plan should include, from specifying who should be involved to procedures to recover data to stopping the incident from continuing. Also, depending on what type of cyber incident occurred, the firm should consider if other parties should be notified, for example, federal or provincial privacy commissions. Surprisingly, for this question, one firm commented that the cost of a cyber incident would be borne by insurance, so an incident response plan wasn't necessary. But I do think that there are other things to consider about the effects of a cyber incident, such as the firm's reputational risk. I do not think you would want your firm's hacking to be the weekly cybersecurity story in the news. Approximately 50% of the firms that responded to the survey stated that they had experienced some form of cyber incident. The most common type of incident reported was phishing, described as emails or text messages designed to gather personal, financial, and sensitive information. Some firms commented that they had occasional viruses that were picked up by their antivirus software, or that someone had attempted to impersonate a senior member of the firm to transfer funds. These would be examples of the different types of cyber attacks firms would likely want to include in their incident response plans. Brian, what has your experience been with clients using incident response plans?
Well, it's true, most clients do have incident response plans. They're often not fully vetted or tested. One thing we always recommend is conducting a tabletop exercise where the incident response plan is something that where the incident response plan is gone over by the people who are involved in it. A tabletop exercise gathers everyone in the incident response plan in a room, hand out the incident response plan to everyone, and then ask the group to respond to a scenario such as ransomware, a data breach, or all IT systems being offline. Just like testing your backups or disaster recovery plans, this tabletop exercise flushes out any gaps or situations that aren't otherwise addressed.
Most firms use outside service providers in their operations. In fact, the survey showed over 90% of firms do. It is important that the firm's due diligence of service providers includes a review of their cybersecurity policies and perhaps include this in their written agreements with the service providers. Some firms commented on the survey that they don't have written agreements with their service providers, whereas other firms stated that their agreements include requiring service providers to actually notify the firm of any breaches or security incidents. Many of the firms responded that they use cloud services. The cloud should also be considered a service provider, and firms should be reviewing the cybersecurity policies and procedures of the cloud service provider. Brian, what are some of the concerns with using a cloud service provider?
In the past, security was considered the biggest risk with cloud solutions, but in fact, cloud services may actually be more secure because the cloud provider has much greater resources to monitor and protect your data than a small firm may have with keeping their data in-house. But one concern that is valid with cloud services is how to mitigate the failure of the cloud provider. Primarily, how do you have a backup and disaster recovery plan in the event that the cloud service fails?
We also asked firms if they had cybersecurity insurance. The majority of firms did not, and for those who did have insurance, the types of things covered by the insurance varied widely. I have heard from a number of firms that to obtain cybersecurity insurance, the firm is required to have cybersecurity policies and procedures and a risk assessment, which happen to fit nicely with our expectations. Brian, have you assisted any firms with getting cybersecurity insurance?
Yes, we're often asked to assist with completing the IT and security sections of the security policies from our clients. We've also worked with the insurance companies who've asked us to assist their potential clients to address some of the large gaps that would otherwise make obtaining cyber insurance difficult or significantly more expensive. The insurance company policies are generally written with the assumption that all the basic practices are already in place, having good backups, protecting against viruses and obvious security threats, and have documented IT policies. If you have to say no to any of these items, it's usually red flagged on an application.
The staff notice also has a section related to data protection. We found out that many firms use encryption on some or all of their devices, whereas others rely on passwords to protect their data. Some of the interesting comments on these questions included that the firm strives to not use PDFs, that the firm doesn't allow any portable devices on their network, and that the firm doesn't allow any data on their personal devices. These sound like ways to control data from being hacked. However, we hope that firms weren't solely relying on these controls for their cybersecurity requirements. In addition, we asked firms how often they backed up their data. Overwhelmingly, firms back up their data daily, if not more often, such as continuously, every 5 minutes, or hourly. Hopefully, they have tested the process for getting this data recovered should they need to. Brian, can you elaborate on some recommendations for firms protecting their data and IT systems?
I can. That's sort of a big question, though, so that's what I'll cover off in the next section about what can you do. In this section, I'll cover off the basics that a company needs to protect their data and their IT systems. One of the first things that companies do is should reach out to have expert IT advice. In the same way that not every IT person understands databases or programming, not every IT person is a cybersecurity expert. Cybersecurity exists as a special area within IT. In addition to cybersecurity plans, your firm's risk assessments, backups, disaster recovery plans, and incident response plans should be reviewed annually, or as any significant changes occur, and getting feedback from security experts. Preventative maintenance is also critical to having a solid IT infrastructure. Windows patching, that's applying the updates that Microsoft releases every month. For smaller organizations, typically they just install all the patches that Microsoft releases. Larger organizations are those with applications that have particular requirements that they can't just install all patches, will have to test the patches and approve them before they push them out to all their computers. Many cybersecurity issues have happened because existing known patches were not applied. For example, the patch that fixed the WannaCry vulnerability was released in March of 2017, 2 months before the WannaCry virus made its first appearance, but many organizations had not yet applied the patch. Over 200,000 PCs were infected the first day. And some exploits may only require one unpatched PC to start an outbreak. So the unpatched PC could be the gateway inside the network, and then other things are infected. Also, network equipment, things like switches and firewalls, should be periodically updated. These are often overlooked, particularly in smaller companies where staff may not have the expertise for updating them. And as mentioned earlier, the Intel CPU vulnerability with Meltdown Inspector made people aware that there are areas of IT that are outside of just regular Windows patching that need to be addressed. Since you cannot guarantee that ransomware or data loss will never occur, backups and disaster recovery have to be part of every cyber strategy as well. One important piece, and seen on the diagram, is the long-term archive. This is data that's never overwritten and it's separate from your other backups and disaster recovery images. Some firms may already be archiving their email using things like Global Relay or Office 365 compliance features, and other people are using things like Barracuda and CrashPlan for long-term archives. The idea is that if your company does become infected or your files are encrypted, the long-term archive will still have a known good copy of all of your critical data. When using the cloud, a company must still ultimately be responsible for their own backups and disaster recovery, and service performance needs to be put in place via service level agreements when they sign up for the cloud services. It's not usually possible for a firm to change a cloud provider's service level agreements. For example, Office 365 email has defined backups, recovery, uptime, performance measures in place as part of their standard contracts, and these cannot be modified. So they must be accepted and built into a firm's instant response plan if the firm wants to use those cloud service providers. With best practices for disaster recovery, every client environment has different technical details and tolerances for downtime, but they all need to answer the same questions. How long can the systems be offline or inaccessible? How do we recover our IT assets, and how much data can be lost during an event? And how do we work during the recovery, and how do we return to regular operations? In many ways, a cyber incident is no different than a natural disaster. Everything can become unusable, and full system replacements could be required. Potential temporary relocation of workers, people working from home versus the office while systems are restored or forensic work is conducted. The picture of the remote hacker in the basement connecting to your system does happen, but it's far more likely the issues will be local. Malware running on a PC, or even if there's a person connecting remotely to your systems, is likely they're doing what they're doing inside your environment that matters most. Also, moving to the cloud makes monitoring more important and often more complex as you have more front doors for users to go through. Systems called intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems are used to provide alerts and block activity inside your environment before issues manifest themselves. In regards to IT security responsibilities, the IT infrastructure prevents most of the common IT risks, but technology and IT infrastructure cannot prevent everything. Users are your company's greatest asset and the biggest liability when it comes to cybersecurity. This next section reviews a few of the most important areas in regards to user education and behavior. Social engineering and user negligence are much simpler ways into an organization than technical attacks, comparable to going in through an unlocked side door rather than breaking down the front door in terms of effort. Once you have the basics covered with network protection with firewalls, a lockdown network, anti-spam for email, the next most common attack vector to be exploited is the user. Users without ongoing security awareness training or having messages reinforced about IT best practices are much more likely to be acceptable to opening phishing emails or giving out their passwords or corporate information. When we run phishing email campaigns, there are different levels where we test users. If a user responds to a simple phishing email request, like clicking on a link, then we escalate the campaign. Next, we get the user to see if they'll give us a password. And then after that, we get them to see if they'll install an application. And at the top level, we'll ask users for their coworker information. Provide us 3 emails and a phone number in exchange for a $5 Best Buy coupon. The click-through rates that we experience are much, much higher for users who don't have any security awareness training or don't regularly have the messages reinforced. Typically, less than 5% of users who have training will respond to these messages, and it tends to be higher than 20% for users without any training will gladly give us the information. It can be argued that usernames and passwords by themselves are no longer enough to truly be secure. They can be compromised via technical hacks and guessed by brute force methods, but since most systems still only have username and passwords to control access, passwords still do matter. One of the simplest ways to make passwords difficult to guess is to make them very long rather than very complex. For example, the 2 passwords on the screen, brown basket 4 and spelling the word password with special characters in uppercase, lowercase, and numbers. Times to guess those passwords for brown basket 4 with a hacking system who guesses passwords would take about 2 days. The password would take about 18 minutes. And it's also very difficult for users to remember those long and complicated passwords. For authentication best practices, since I believe that just a username and a password is no longer enough, particularly with applications that have public access, companies should be moving to something called 2-factor authentication for anything that supports it. What is 2-factor authentication? Your username and your password are the first factor for your login. They're something you know. And then the second factor would be usually an application on your phone that either has a pop-up or calls you when you log in. So the application is something you have. That's the second factor. No different than using a bank card and having a PIN number when you go to a bank machine. And a story about the value of 2-factor authentication. A user gives his password to an IT support person, actually a cyber criminal using a social engineering attack, and the criminal was able to access the company's systems via remote desktop. Access continued for 3 months until the user next changed their password and the account was locked out. During a security review, it was determined that the user account was logging in at odd times, usually between midnight and 5 a.m., and from an odd location. The user worked in Toronto, but was seen to be regularly logging in from China, somewhere just outside of Shanghai. There's multiple ways to prevent this type of behavior. The first line would be adding in two-factor authentication for all remote access in critical applications. Other features like user anomaly monitoring, so strange login times or login locations from unusual places generate alerts. And also limiting login times to times that users are likely to need. If users normally only work during the day or in the evening, it's not necessarily best practices to give them 24/7 access. The user response to IT threats come back to security awareness training. For example, we had a user who had a pop-up screen that ransomware warning at 4 p.m. on a Friday. Rather than deal with it, the person decides that this is a reason to leave early, as they were sure that IT would be aware of this kind of problem. It took about 16 hours for IT to realize that there was a problem, and about this point, 400,000 files, about half of the firm's data, had been encrypted, and it took another 48 hours to fully restore all systems. Users who know how to respond can prevent cyber events, or at least mitigate the damage that they do. My experience with providing IT support is companies that do regular user training have more vigilant users. The users report suspicious issues more quickly and are much more likely to contact IT support to ask security questions when in doubt. Mobile devices have also become a new area of concern. Malware exists for smartphones, particularly Android phones, which are more prone to risk than iPhones. It's estimated that of phones with malware in Canada, iPhones have about 4%, while Android phones are responsible for about 80%, and approximately 1.5% of all Android phones have active malware running on them. Company policies about bring your own device to work introduces additional risks, as there's less control over staff's own mobile devices, what applications they've installed, and whether there is any malware running. There's also concerns with legal liability over what a company can or can't do with someone's personal devices. For example, is it okay to delete 5 years of family photos on a phone because you want to remotely wipe a lost phone that may contain corporate data? I would recommend least privileges required for phone access to corporate networks for these reasons. If users are not accessing internal resources or applications on their phones, then there's no reason they should be connected to the regular corporate network. Also, when we look at a typical corporate network, for example, when we scan a network on a 10-person company, we may have 25 devices on the network. Everyone has a phone, and they may bring a few tablets as well. So not only are there security concerns, also just the load and level of monitoring required to maintain all of these personal devices. Mobile devices start to blur the line between corporate and personal IT, with users often putting personal email and applications on corporate phones, even if IT policies are against this. Other personal IT devices, like home PCs or personal notebooks that people bring in, or having insecure home networks, are also of concerns, since home networks are generally less secure than corporate IT assets. Personal IT is less likely to be patched, may not have antivirus software, and may not be running current versions of software. Defense in depth is what we would recommend for how to protect a network. Returning to the slide at the beginning of the presentation shows what a typical organization looks like, and we will then compare it to what I believe an organization should be striving to have, a defense in depth strategy where there are multiple layers of cybersecurity protection, not just a strong perimeter. Also, any size organization can implement a defense in depth strategy. The technical details will vary, but the principles are the same. Defense in depth starts by ranking the importance of where you'll place your protection in your organization. This diagram shows the order that organizations should be protecting themselves, and it is important to note that people are the first line and the most important element of keeping things secure, and not technology. Physical security refers to protecting assets like locks on doors and not letting unauthorized users into your IT environment. Network security is protecting the network with firewalls, monitoring, intrusion detection systems, and other technology. Computer security is the antivirus threat protection using secure passwords. Application security, limiting access to applications to data to those who truly need it. And finally, data is the keys to the kingdom, the innermost layer of your defenses, controlled by limiting access to those to the access, and also can use encryption. What defense in depth looks like in an environment, when we compare what an environment looks like with a defense in depth strategy, there are fewer single points of failure for IT security. If one layer of your cybersecurity plan fails or is compromised, others still remain, so you're less likely to experience major impact from one incident. The technology details used to implement these layers to vary depending on the size and complexity of your IT environment, but the model is scalable. The challenge of cybersecurity may appear overwhelming with the pace of cybersecurity changes and with the level of risk with ransomware, privacy breaches, and reputational risk. But like other areas of the business, there are logical and practical steps that every organization should do, regardless of the size of the company.
At this time, we will try to answer the questions that you've already submitted, and if you haven't already done so, please submit your questions now.